The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street of Clearwater, Montana, population 3,847, where everybody knew everybody and secrets were harder to keep than snow in July. Sheriff Daniel Dan Mercer stood on the worn wooden porch of his office, thumbs hooked in his belt, watching the unfamiliar silver SUV roll slowly down Main Street. In a town where a new face was an event worth discussing over coffee at Me's Diner for a week straight, this stranger's arrival would be tonight's headline. Dan was 42 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered by Montana winters and the weight of a badge he'd worn for nearly 20 years. His dark hair was starting to show silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes told stories of too many late nights and too few easy answers. He'd been sheriff for 8 years now, following in his father's footsteps and his grandfather's before that. The Mercer name was practically synonymous with law enforcement in Clearwater County. The SUV pulled into a parking space in front of the old Turner building, which had sat empty since the hardware store closed down 3 years ago. Dan's eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't heard anything about someone buying the property, and in Clearwater he usually heard everything. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Dan felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar flutter that he immediately tried to dismiss. The stranger was tall, maybe 6'1", with sandy blonde hair that looked deliberately tousled. He wore dark jeans, brown leather boots, and a blue Henley that showed off an athletic build. Even from across the street, Dan could see he was handsome in a way that didn't belong in Clearwater, polished, confident, distinctly urban. The man stretched, looking up and down the street with an expression that Dan couldn't quite read. Not dismissive exactly, but appraising, like he was measuring the town against some internal standard. "Sheriff Mercer?" Deputy Katie Rodriguez appeared at Dan's elbow, making him start slightly. At 28, Katie was sharp as a tack and had a disconcerting ability to appear out of nowhere. "You know who that is?" "Was about to ask you the same thing," Dan replied, keeping his voice casual. "Saw the paperwork come through county records last week," Katie said, pulling out her phone and swiping through it with practiced efficiency. "His name is, here it is, Ethan Cole, bought the Turner building, paid cash according to Doris at the title company, planning to open some kind of bookstore and coffee shop." Dan's eyebrows rose. "A bookstore here?" "That's what Doris said. She said he's from Seattle, some kind of writer, I think." Katie glanced at Dan with a knowing look. "Whole town's going to be talking about him by dinner time." "Already are, probably," Dan muttered. He watched as Ethan Cole pulled a briefcase and a cardboard box from the back of his SUV, balancing them with easy grace as he unlocked the door to the building. "Guess I should go introduce myself, welcome him to town." "That's very community-minded of you, Sheriff," Katie said, and there was definitely a note of amusement in her voice that Dan chose to ignore. He stepped off the porch and crossed the street, his boots hitting the pavement with familiar authority. Up close, Ethan Cole was even more striking, green eyes that seemed to catch the afternoon light, a strong jawline with just a hint of stubble, and an easy smile that appeared as Dan approached. "Afternoon," Dan said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture so ingrained it was automatic. "Sheriff Dan Mercer, welcome to Clearwater." Ethan set down his box and extended his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and sent an unexpected jolt up Dan's arm that he definitely did not want to examine too closely. "Ethan Cole, nice to meet you, Sheriff." "Heard you bought the Turner place," Dan said, releasing Ethan's hand perhaps a fraction of a second later than was strictly necessary. "Planning to open a bookstore?" "Bookstore and coffee shop," Ethan confirmed. "I know it might seem like an odd choice for a town this size, but I did my research. Nearest bookstore is 45 miles away in Helena, and I think there's room for a community space here, somewhere people can gather, you know." Dan found himself impressed despite his natural small-town skepticism toward outsiders with big ideas. "That's actually not a bad idea. Town could use something like that." "That's what I'm hoping." Ethan's smile widened and Dan noticed the way it crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm planning to call it Chapter and Verse. Books upstairs, coffee shop downstairs, maybe some open mic nights, book clubs, that sort of thing." "Ambitious," Dan observed. He should probably go let the man get settled, but he found himself oddly reluctant to end the conversation. "You from Seattle originally?" "Born and raised," Ethan confirmed. "But I needed a change. The city was getting to be too much, too fast, too loud, too impersonal. I wanted somewhere I could actually know my neighbors, you know, somewhere real." There was something in the way Ethan said real that caught Dan's attention. It wasn't condescending or romanticized, just honest. Like he understood that small-town life came with its own complications but wanted it anyway. "Well, you'll definitely know your neighbors here," Dan said with a slight smile. "Whether you want to or not, fair warning, by tonight everyone in town will know your name, where you're from, what you're planning to do, and probably what you had for breakfast." Ethan laughed, a genuine sound that did strange things to Dan's pulse. "I'm counting on it. Community, right? The good with the observant." "Diplomatic way to put it," Dan said. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware that he'd been standing here chatting for longer than a simple welcome required. "Listen, if you need anything, recommendations for contractors, electricians, anything like that, feel free to stop by the office, or me's diner down the street. Me knows everything and everyone." "I'll do that, thank you, Sheriff." Ethan's eyes held Dan's for a moment longer than necessary, and Dan could have sworn he saw something flicker in their green depths: interest, maybe, or curiosity. Dan touched his hat again and turned to go, then paused. "And it's Dan. Around here, Sheriff Mercer is what people call me when they're in trouble or being formal." "Dan," Ethan repeated, and the way he said it made Dan's name sound different somehow. "I'll remember that." As Dan walked back across the street, he could feel Ethan's gaze on his back. He resisted the urge to turn around, instead climbing the steps to his office with measured steps. Katie was waiting inside, not even pretending she hadn't been watching the entire exchange. "So," she asked, raising an eyebrow. "So what? So what did you think of our new resident?" Dan shrugged, moving past her to his desk. "Seems nice enough. We'll see if he makes it through his first winter." Katie snorted. "Right, that's all you noticed, that he seems nice enough. What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, Sheriff." Katie's grin was entirely too knowing. "Nothing at all." Dan sat down at his desk, pulling a stack of paperwork toward him with more force than necessary. He tried to focus on the words in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to green eyes and an easy smile, to the warm pressure of a handshake that had lasted just a heartbeat too long. He'd spent 20 years building a life in Clearwater, wearing his father's badge and living up to his family's legacy. He'd been married once to Sarah Mitchell, his high school sweetheart. That had lasted 6 years before she'd sat him down and said as gently as possible that she knew, that she'd always known even before he'd admitted it to himself, that she loved him but couldn't keep pretending, and neither should he. The divorce had been quiet, amicable, and had somehow managed to avoid becoming complete fodder for the town gossip mill. Sarah had moved to Billings, remarried, had 2 kids. They still exchanged Christmas cards, and Dan had stayed in Clearwater, buried himself in his work, and carefully kept the deepest parts of himself locked away. In Clearwater, Montana, being the sheriff meant being a pillar of the community. It meant being what people expected, what they needed. It meant not rocking boats or challenging assumptions or doing anything that might make folks uncomfortable. It meant not noticing when a handsome stranger came to town. Except Dan had noticed, he'd noticed everything. And that, he thought as he stared unseeing at the incident report in front of him, was going to be a problem. 3 weeks later, Ethan's renovation of the Turner building was in full swing. The sound of hammers and power tools had become a familiar part of Clearwater's daily soundtrack, and the town had mostly accepted his presence with the cautious welcome typical of small communities. Mostly. Dan had made a point of not going over to the building site. He'd driven past it dozens of times, of course. It was right on Main Street, impossible to avoid. He'd seen the progress, new windows being installed, the exterior being repainted a warm cream color with forest green trim, the old sign coming down. He'd also seen Ethan, usually in work clothes, covered in sawdust or paint, directing contractors or hauling materials himself. The man clearly wasn't afraid of hard work, which had earned him points with the locals who'd been skeptical about a city boy's ability to handle a real project. Dan had successfully avoided any direct interaction until the morning Katie walked into his office with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smile. "Before you say anything," she started, setting 1 cup on his desk, "me asked me to give you a message." Dan looked up warily. "What message?" She said, and I quote, "Tell that stubborn sheriff that if he doesn't get his ass over to welcome Ethan Cole properly, I'm going to drag him over there myself." Katie's grin widened. Her words, not mine. "I already welcomed him 3 weeks ago." Apparently me thinks you should do it again, maybe bring a housewarming gift or something. Katie perched on the edge of his desk. You know, boss, for someone who's usually so good at the whole community relations thing, you're being weird about this. Dan took a long drink of his coffee to avoid responding immediately. Katie wasn't wrong. He had been avoiding Ethan and it was starting to look obvious. In a town where the sheriff was expected to know everyone and be visible in the community, his careful avoidance of one particular newcomer was bound to be noticed. Fine, he said finally, I'll stop by later today. Good, because between you and me, I think the guy could use a friendly face. Bill Thompson's been giving him grief about the building permits, and you know how Hank Peterson feels about outsiders changing things. Dan frowned. What kind of grief? Nothing major, just, making things difficult. Extra inspections, questioning every decision. I think Bill's still sore that nobody consulted him before Ethan bought the place, even though it was none of his business. Katie stood up. Anyway, maybe having the sheriff on his side would help. After Katie left, Dan sat at his desk for a long moment, staring at the stack of paperwork that never seemed to get any smaller. Then he pushed back his chair with a sigh, grabbed his hat, and headed out. The Turner building, he really needed to start thinking of it as chapter and verse, was buzzing with activity when Dan arrived. The front door stood open, and he could hear the sound of classic rock playing from somewhere inside. He climbed the newly reinforced front steps and knocked on the doorframe. Come in, Ethan's voice called from somewhere above. Dan stepped inside and stopped, genuinely impressed. The last time he'd been in this building was years ago, when it had been a dusty, cramped hardware store with low ceilings and poor lighting. Now, even mid-renovation, he could see the transformation. The first floor had been opened up, walls removed to create a spacious area where the coffee shop would be. New windows flooded the space with natural light. The old drop ceiling had been torn out, revealing the original pressed tin ceiling that someone, probably Ethan, had painstakingly cleaned and restored. Be right down? Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, again in work clothes, this time worn jeans and a gray t-shirt that had seen better days. His hair was dusty and there was a smudge of something on his cheek, but his smile when he saw Dan was bright and genuine. Sheriff Dan, hi, this is a nice surprise. Thought I'd stop by, see how the work's coming along, Dan said, removing his hat. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, I was just trying to decide on paint colors for upstairs. Ethan came down the stairs, wiping his hands on his jeans. Want the tour? Sure. As Ethan led him through the space, explaining his vision for each area, Dan found himself drawn in despite his intentions to keep this brief. Ethan's enthusiasm was infectious. He talked about creating reading nooks upstairs with comfortable chairs and good lighting, about sourcing coffee from a roaster in Missoula, about partnering with local bakers for pastries. I know it probably seems overly ambitious, Ethan said as they stood in what would become the main bookstore area upstairs. But I really think this town is ready for something like this. There's no gathering place here besides the diner and the bar. Nowhere people can just exist together, without the pressure to eat or drink or socialize in a specific way. It's a good idea, Dan said honestly. Really good. Town needs more people willing to invest in it, not just pass through. Ethan's smile softened into something more genuine, less performance. Thanks, that means a lot actually. I know I'm the outsider here and I'm trying to respect that while also, actually doing what I came here to do. Heard you've been having some trouble with permits. Ethan's expression turned rueful. Word travels fast. Yeah, Bill Thompson seems to think every decision I make needs to be reviewed by committee. Last week he made me redo the electrical inspection 3 times because he wasn't satisfied with the contractor's credentials, even though the guy's licensed and has been working in Montana for 20 years. Dan felt a familiar spark of irritation. Bill Thompson had been the town's self-appointed guardian of tradition for as long as Dan could remember, which mostly meant he liked to make life difficult for anyone who did things differently than they'd always been done. That's not right, Dan said. The permits are handled at the county level anyway. Bill's on the town council, but that doesn't give him authority over building inspections. I know, I've been trying to stay polite, not make waves, but... Ethan trailed off, running a hand through his dusty hair. It's frustrating, I just want to open my business. I'll talk to him, Dan said, surprising himself with the immediate offer. Ethan's eyebrows rose. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, but Bill needs to be reminded that he doesn't run this town no matter what he thinks. Dan settled his hat back on his head. You're doing everything by the book. There's no reason for him to give you grief. Thank you, Ethan said quietly, and the gratitude in his eyes was almost overwhelming. Really, I appreciate it. They stood there for a moment in the dusty, half-finished bookstore, afternoon light streaming through the new windows, and Dan felt that same flutter in his chest he'd felt the first time they met. Ethan was close enough that Dan could see flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell sawdust and paint and something underneath that was just him. Dan cleared his throat and took a step back. I should let you get back to work. Right, yeah, was that disappointment in Ethan's voice, or was Dan imagining it? Thanks for stopping by and for, offering to help. Part of the job, Dan said, even though they both knew it wasn't really. As Dan walked back to his office, he pulled out his phone and called Bill Thompson. The conversation was brief and not particularly pleasant, but by the end of it, Bill had agreed, grudgingly, to stop creating unnecessary obstacles for Ethan's renovation. Katie looked up when Dan walked back in. How'd it go? Fine, Dan said shortly. Just fine. The building looks good. He's doing a nice job with it. Dan sat down at his desk, trying to ignore Katie's knowing look. I called Bill Thompson, told him to back off the permit harassment. Katie's eyebrows rose. Did you now? The man's following all the regulations. No reason to make things difficult for him. Mum, very community-minded of you, Sheriff. Dan shot her a look. Don't you have work to do? Tons, Katie agreed cheerfully, not moving. But this is more interesting. There's nothing interesting happening, Rodriguez. If you say so, boss. She finally stood up, heading for the door. But for what it's worth, I think it's nice what you're doing for him. After she left, Dan tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to the bookstore, to Ethan's smile, to the way he'd said thank you like it meant something more than just words. This was dangerous territory. Dan had built his life here on careful control, on being exactly what the town expected him to be. Getting involved with Ethan Cole, even just as a friend, even just as a helpful sheriff welcoming a new business owner, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. But even as he thought it, Dan knew it was already too late. He was already involved, already drawn in by those green eyes and that easy laugh and the genuine passion Ethan brought to everything he did. The only question now was how far he was willing to fall. Part 3, Coffee and Confessions. Chapter and verse opened on a crisp October morning, 2 months after Ethan had first arrived in Clearwater. The whole town turned out for the grand opening, partly out of genuine curiosity, partly because there wasn't much else happening on a Saturday morning, and partly because Me had spread the word that Ethan was serving free coffee and pastries all day. Dan had planned to make a brief appearance, show his support as sheriff, and then leave. Instead, he found himself still there 3 hours later, watching Ethan work the room with natural charm, answering questions about the books, making coffee recommendations, and somehow remembering everyone's names after hearing them just once. The building had been transformed. The downstairs coffee shop was warm and inviting, with exposed brick walls, comfortable seating areas, and a gleaming espresso machine behind a reclaimed wood counter. Upstairs, the bookstore was a maze of shelves organized by genre, with cozy reading nooks tucked into corners and large windows letting in the autumn light. Pretty impressive, right? Katie appeared at Dan's elbow, holding a latte with some kind of design on top. It is, Dan admitted. He was standing near the stairs, trying to look like he was just generally observing rather than specifically watching Ethan explain the coffee menu to Martha Henderson. He did good work. Katie took a sip of her coffee. And he's already got half the town eating out of his hand. Mrs. Peterson was just telling me she's going to join his book club. Hank Peterson's wife. Yep, the same Hank who was complaining about city folk ruining the town just a month ago. Katie grinned. Ethan's got a gift, people like him. Dan made a noncommittal sound. He'd noticed everything about Ethan over the past 2 months, the way he'd integrated himself into the community, showing up at town council meetings and local events, learning people's stories, genuinely caring about the town he'd chosen to make his home. He'd also noticed how Ethan always seemed to save a particular smile for Dan, how their conversations had gradually extended from polite small talk to genuine discussions about books and life and what it meant to find a place where you belonged. "You should get some coffee," Katie suggested, "since you're here and all." "I don't need coffee." "Sheriff Mercer," Ethan's voice came from behind him, warm and teasing. "Are you lurking in my bookstore without buying anything? I'm pretty sure that's loitering." Dan turned to find Ethan standing there with that smile, the one that seemed reserved just for him, just observing, making sure everything's safe and orderly. "Ah, official business, of course." Ethan's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Well, since you're here on official business, let me officially offer you a cup of coffee on the house." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, I want to." Ethan gestured toward the counter. "Come on, let me make you something." Katie had conveniently disappeared and Dan found himself following Ethan to the coffee bar. The crowd had thinned out a bit, giving them a moment of relative privacy. "What do you like?" Ethan asked, moving behind the counter with practiced ease. "Straight black coffee, latte, I do a mean cappuccino." "Black coffee's fine," Dan said, then added, "but if you're showing off, I wouldn't say no to trying whatever you think is best." Ethan's smile widened. "Dangerous words, Sheriff, never give a coffee snob free rein." But he set to work and Dan watched as he pulled espresso shots, steamed milk and created something that looked far too fancy for a Montana bookstore. "Flat white," Ethan said, sliding the cup across the counter. "Simple, but if it's done right, it's perfect, try it." Dan took a sip and had to suppress a reaction. It was good, rich and smooth and exactly the right temperature. "This is definitely not the coffee at Me's diner." "Me's coffee has its place," Ethan said diplomatically, "but yeah, this is a different thing entirely. Good." "Very good." Dan took another sip, watching Ethan over the rim of the cup. "You've done an amazing job with this place, really. I know I said it before, but seeing it all come together, it's impressive." A faint flush colored Ethan's cheeks. "Thanks, it means a lot hearing that from you." "Why from me specifically?" Ethan leaned against the counter, lowering his voice even though no one was close enough to hear. "Because you were one of the first people to actually give me a chance here. Everyone else was friendly enough, but I could tell they were reserving judgment. You just treated me like a person, like I belonged here even when I wasn't sure I did." Dan felt something tighten in his chest. "You do belong here, you've proven that." "Have I?" Ethan's expression turned more serious. "I know small towns, I know how they work. I'm still the outsider, probably always will be to some degree, but I'm okay with that as long as I can build something meaningful here." "You already have," Dan said quietly. "Look around, this isn't just a bookstore, it's—" "You were right about what you said that first day, about creating a gathering place, you've done that." They stood there for a moment, the busy sounds of the coffee shop fading into background noise. Ethan's eyes held Dan's and there was something in them, a question maybe or an invitation. "Dan," Ethan started, then stopped as a customer approached the counter. "Excuse me, Ethan, could I get another one of those cinnamon rolls?" "Of course, Mrs. Chen." Ethan's professional smile snapped back into place, but he glanced at Dan. "Don't go anywhere." Dan nodded and moved to the side, sipping his coffee and watching Ethan work. He knew he should leave, he'd been here too long already and people would start to notice. But he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to walk away. The grand opening continued around him. Dan talked to townspeople, accepted their compliments on how well he'd integrated the new business into the community as if he'd had anything to do with it, and tried not to be too obvious about tracking Ethan's movements around the room. It was late afternoon when the crowd finally began to thin. Dan had helped Ethan clean up, stacking chairs and wiping down tables in a companionable silence. "You didn't have to stay and help," Ethan said, carrying a tray of dirty cups to the back. "I know." Dan folded the last tablecloth and set it on the counter. "Wanted to." When Ethan came back out, he locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in gold. They were alone for the first time all day. "Can I show you something?" Ethan asked. "Upstairs, I saved the best part for last." Intrigued, Dan followed him up to the bookstore level. Ethan led him past the main shelves to a door Dan hadn't noticed before. It opened onto a small balcony that overlooked Main Street. I had them add this during the renovation, Ethan explained, stepping outside. It's not much, but I thought it would be nice to have a place to escape to, somewhere quiet. The balcony was just big enough for 2 chairs and a small table. From here, they could see most of Clearwater spread out below, the main street with its mix of old storefronts, the church steeple rising in the distance, the mountains beyond turning purple in the fading light. It's perfect, Dan said and meant it. They sat down in the chairs and for a while neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, easy in a way that Dan hadn't experienced in years. With most people, he felt the need to fill silences to maintain the persona of the friendly, approachable sheriff. With Ethan, he could just be. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said finally, his voice quiet. "Sure. Why did you really help me with Bill Thompson, with the permits, with all of it? And don't say it's just part of your job." Dan was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower. This was it, the moment where he could deflect, make a joke, keep his walls up, or he could be honest. "Because I wanted to," he said finally. "Because I liked you from the moment I met you and I wanted you to succeed here." He felt rather than saw Ethan turn to look at him. "Liked me how?" Dan's heart hammered in his chest. This was dangerous. This was everything he'd been carefully avoiding for 20 years, but sitting here in the golden light. With Ethan looking at him with those impossibly green eyes, he found he was tired of being careful. "The way you probably think I do," Dan said quietly, "the way I shouldn't but do anyway." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Dan kept his eyes on the mountains, not ready to see Ethan's reaction, not ready for the rejection or the awkwardness or whatever came next. "Dan," Ethan's voice was soft, "look at me." Slowly, Dan turned his head. Ethan was leaning forward in his chair, his expression serious but not uncomfortable, not pulling away. "I came to Clearwater for a lot of reasons," Ethan said. "Fresh start, slower pace of life, a place to build something that mattered, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't also running away from something, or someone more accurately, a relationship that ended badly that reminded me how exhausting it is to hide who you are." Dan's breath caught. "Ethan." "I'm not hiding anymore," Ethan continued. "I'm not advertising it, but I'm not hiding, and I understand if that's not something you can, if that's not where you are, I get it. Small town, your position, your reputation, I wouldn't ask you to risk that." "What if I wanted to?" The words were out before Dan could stop them. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Do you?" Did he? Dan thought about the past 20 years, the careful construction of his life, the walls he'd built, the parts of himself he'd locked away. He thought about his father's legacy, the badge he wore, the expectations of a town that had known him since he was born. And then he thought about how he felt when he was with Ethan, lighter, more himself, more alive than he'd felt in longer than he could remember. "I don't know," Dan said honestly. "I don't know what I'm ready for or what I can handle, but I know I don't want to keep pretending I don't feel something when I see you. I'm tired of pretending." Ethan reached across the space between their chairs and took Dan's hand. His palm was warm, his grip steady. "Then don't pretend, not with me, we can figure out the rest as we go." Dan looked down at their joined hands, at how natural it felt, how right. "People will talk. People always talk, but they don't have to know everything. We can be friends, publicly, get to know each other. The rest stays between us until you're ready, if you're ever ready." "And if I'm never ready," Dan forced himself to ask, "if I can't risk everything I've built here?" "Then we're friends," Ethan said simply. "I'd rather have you in my life as a friend than not at all." Dan squeezed Ethan's hand, overwhelmed by the understanding in his eyes. "I don't deserve that kind of patience." "Maybe not, but you're getting it anyway." Ethan smiled, that particular smile he saved just for Dan. "Besides, I'm not going anywhere, I just opened a bookstore, I'm invested now." Despite everything, Dan laughed. The sound surprised him. When was the last time he'd felt light enough to laugh about something this terrifying? They sat there as the sun set over Clearwater, hands linked, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Dan told Ethan about growing up here, about the weight of the badge and his family's legacy. Ethan talked about Seattle, about the relationship that had broken his heart, about his dream of finding a place where he could be wholly himself. As the stars began to appear, Dan realized that for the first time in 20 years he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not certainty, not a clear path forward, but the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to choose between who he was and the life he'd built. Maybe there was room for both. Maybe there was room for Ethan. And maybe that was enough to start with. Part 4: The Weight of Secrets. The weeks following the grand opening of chapter and verse settled into a rhythm that both thrilled and terrified Dan. He and Ethan had become what the town saw as good friends, Dan stopping by the bookstore for coffee most mornings, Ethan joining him for lunch at Me's Diner a few times a week, the two of them occasionally grabbing a beer at Murphy's Tavern after Dan's shift ended. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like what they claimed it was, the sheriff befriending a newcomer, helping him integrate into the community. And it was that, but it was also more. It was stolen moments on Ethan's balcony when the bookstore was closed, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, talking until the stars came out. It was text messages that had nothing to do with official business and everything to do with wanting to hear from each other. It was learning the cadence of someone else's breathing, the exact shade their eyes turned in different light, the way their smile changed when it was real versus polite. It was falling, slowly and terrifyingly, into something Dan had never expected to feel. November brought the first real snow, transforming Clearwater into a postcard version of itself. Dan was in his office, reviewing budget reports and trying not to think about the fact that he hadn't seen Ethan in 2 days due to a minor crisis involving cattle thieves on the eastern edge of the county, when his phone rang. "Sheriff Mercer," he answered automatically. "Dan, it's Sarah." Dan sat up straighter, his ex-wife rarely called, usually sticking to the annual Christmas card and occasional email. "Sarah, hi, everything okay?" "Everything's fine, I'm actually calling with good news. Tom got offered a position in Helena. We're moving back to Montana in January." "That's great," Dan said and meant it. Sarah had always missed Montana, even if her marriage to him hadn't worked out. "The kids must be excited." "They are. We'll be about an hour away, so close enough to visit but not on top of you. But Dan," she paused, and he could hear the slight hesitation in her voice. "I've been hearing things about you and this new bookstore owner." Dan's stomach dropped. "What things?" "Nothing bad," Sarah said quickly. "Just that you two have become close, that you're spending a lot of time together, and I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Of all the people in his life, Sarah was the only one who knew the truth about him. She'd known even before he'd fully accepted it himself, had released him from their marriage with grace and understanding that he'd never quite figured out how to repay. Dan started then stopped. "How was he?" "I don't know, Sarah, I'm confused." "Tell me about him." So Dan did. He told her about meeting Ethan that first day, about the bookstore, about conversations on the balcony that stretched into the night. He told her about the way his chest felt tight when Ethan smiled at him, about the terror of wanting something he'd spent 20 years convincing himself he couldn't have. "Dan," Sarah said gently when he finished, "you know I want you to be happy. You deserve to be happy. I have a responsibility to this town, to my badge, to my family's name. Your family's name isn't more important than your life. And your responsibility is to uphold the law and protect people, not to sacrifice who you are to make them comfortable." She paused. "Does he make you happy?" Dan closed his eyes, thinking of Ethan's laugh, the way he listened like Dan's words actually mattered, the peace he felt in his presence. "Yeah, he does." "Then that's what matters. The rest, the town, the gossip, all of it, you'll figure it out. But don't let fear keep you from something real, Dan. I did that to you once, staying in a marriage we both knew wasn't right. Don't do it to yourself again." After they hung up, Dan sat in his office for a long time, staring at the snow falling outside his window. His phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Slow day at the store. Coffee's getting cold without you here." Before he could second-guess himself, Dan grabbed his coat and headed out. "I'll be at chapter and verse if you need me," he told Katie on his way past. "Sure thing, boss," she called after him, and he didn't miss the knowing tone in her voice. The bookstore was quiet when Dan walked in, just a couple of customers browsing the shelves upstairs. Ethan looked up from behind the coffee counter and his face lit up in a way that made Dan's heart skip. "Sheriff Mercer, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Heard you had coffee getting cold," Dan said, approaching the counter. Seemed like a crisis that needed immediate attention. Ethan's smile widened. "Very dedicated of you." He started making Dan's usual flat white, rough morning. Just long had a call from my ex-wife. Ethan's hands stilled for just a fraction of a second before continuing. Everything okay? Yeah, she's moving back to Montana, Helena area. Dan watched Ethan's face carefully but saw only polite interest. She knows about me, about everything. That must make things easier. Having someone who knows. It does. She asked about you actually. Now Ethan did look up, eyebrows raised. She's heard about me. Small town news travels far. She wanted to make sure I was. Dan trailed off, not quite sure how to finish that sentence. Happy, Ethan suggested quietly, sliding the finished coffee across the counter. Yeah, happy. Their eyes met and Dan felt that familiar pull, that magnetic draw that made him want to lean across the counter and close the distance between them. But the bell above the door chimed and they both took a step back as old Mrs. Patterson shuffled in, complaining about the cold. Later, Ethan murmured as Dan picked up his coffee. Later, Dan confirmed. He spent the rest of the day dealing with the mundane realities of small-town law enforcement, a fender bender in the grocery store parking lot, a noise complaint from the Hendersons about their neighbor's dog, paperwork that seemed to multiply like rabbits. But through it all, he found himself watching the clock, counting down to the end of his shift. When 5 o'clock finally rolled around, Dan headed back to chapter and verse. The store was closed, lights dimmed, but Ethan was waiting. He let Dan in through the back door and they climbed the stairs to the balcony in comfortable silence. The evening was cold but clear, stars brilliant against the black Montana sky. They sat in their usual chairs, close enough to share warmth. I've been thinking, Dan started, his breath visible in the cold air, about what you said, about not hiding but not advertising either. Okay, Ethan said carefully. I don't know if I can be public about this, about us, not yet, maybe not ever. This town, my job, my family's legacy, it all feels like too much weight to risk. Dan forced himself to meet Ethan's eyes. But I don't want to just be friends either, not when I feel like this. Like what? Like I'm 17 again, getting nervous before seeing someone, like my day doesn't really start until I hear your voice. Like I want to know everything about you, what you read before bed, how you take your coffee when no one's watching, what you dream about. Dan's voice dropped. Like I'm falling for you and I don't know how to stop it, don't know if I want to. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I told you I wouldn't push, that I'd be patient, and I meant it, but I need you to understand something too. He reached over and took Dan's hand. I didn't come to Clearwater looking for this. I came here to escape complications, to build something simple, and then you walked across the street that first day and every plan I had went out the window. Ethan! Let me finish. I'm falling for you too, Dan. Probably already fell if I'm honest, and I'll take whatever you can give me, stolen moments, secret conversations, this. He squeezed Dan's hand. But I also need you to know that I won't be your guilty secret forever. I've lived that life and I won't do it again. So if this is going to be something, we need to at least be honest about what we're doing. Even if no one else knows, we know. Dan's throat felt tight. What are we doing? I don't know, dating maybe, seeing where this goes. Ethan smiled slightly. I've never done the secret relationship thing before, not really sure of the protocol. Me either. Dan looked down at their joined hands. But I want to try, if you're willing to be patient with me while I figure out how to do this. I'm willing. Ethan leaned closer. Can I kiss you? I've been wanting to since the day we met, and I figure if we're actually doing this, I should probably ask. Dan's heart hammered in his chest. He glanced around reflexively. They were alone, the balcony hidden from street view, no one to see, but even if there had been, he wasn't sure he could have said no. Yeah, he breathed, yeah, you can. Ethan closed the distance between them slowly, giving Dan every opportunity to pull away. But Dan didn't pull away. Instead, he met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deeper, more certain. It had been so long since Dan had let himself feel this, had allowed himself to want someone this way. The kiss was warm and soft and tasted like coffee and possibility, and when they finally pulled apart, Dan felt like something fundamental had shifted in his universe. Wow, Ethan said softly, touching his forehead to Dan's, worth the wait. Dan laughed, a shaky, surprised sound. Yeah, it really was. They stayed on the balcony until the cold drove them inside, talking and stealing kisses, learning the geography of each other in careful increments. Dan felt like he was discovering a part of himself he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed, the part that could want something just for himself, that could be soft and vulnerable and open. When he finally headed home well past midnight, his lips were kiss-swollen and his chest felt lighter than it had in years. His phone buzzed as he pulled into his driveway. "Ethan, I know we're supposed to be careful, but I don't regret tonight, not even a little." "Dan, me either, sleep well." "Ethan, you too, Sheriff." Dan fell asleep with a smile on his face, and for the first time in 20 years he didn't dream about duty or expectations or the weight of his badge. He dreamed about green eyes and warm kisses and the possibility of something more. Part 5, the first test. Winter settled over Clearwater with the intensity only Montana could deliver. The temperature plummeted, snow piled high along Main Street, and the town hunkered down for the long, cold months ahead. For Dan and Ethan, the winter provided unexpected cover. It was natural for Dan to spend more time at the bookstore, which had become an unofficial community hub. People gathered there to escape the cold, to drink coffee and browse books and gossip by the fire Ethan had installed in the reading nook. No one thought twice about the sheriff being there. It was just part of his community presence, his dedication to supporting local business. What they didn't see were the moments stolen in the upstairs office, quick kisses when the store was empty. They didn't see the text messages exchanged throughout the day, the private jokes, the way Dan had started keeping a change of clothes in his truck so he could stay at Ethan's apartment above the store a few nights a week, leaving before dawn so no one would see his truck parked there overnight. It was a careful dance, exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. Dan was reviewing supply orders in his office one gray December morning when Katie walked in with a troubled expression. "Boss, we've got a situation." Dan looked up. "What kind of situation?" "Anonymous tip just came in. Someone's been spray painting slurs on buildings around town, hit the back of the grocery store last night and the side of the Methodist church." Dan's jaw tightened. Clearwater wasn't immune to bigotry, but it was usually of the quiet, behind-closed-doors variety. Public vandalism was unusual. "What kind of slurs?" Katie's expression was grim, homophobic ones, pretty ugly stuff. Something cold settled in Dan's stomach. "Show me." They drove to the church first. The vandalism was on the north side, away from the street, ugly red spray paint spelling out words that made Dan's blood boil. Reverend Patricia Matthews was already there with a bucket of paint remover, her face set in determined lines. "Sheriff," she greeted him, "I've already called our insurance. I want this covered up before the Sunday school kids see it." "We'll help you," Dan said. "Katie, take photos for evidence first, then let's get this cleaned up." As they worked, Dan felt a growing unease. Clearwater had always been conservative, but it had also been generally tolerant in that Midwestern don't ask, don't tell, we're all neighbors here kind of way. This felt different, aggressive, angry. "Any idea who might have done this?" Reverend Matthews asked as she scrubbed at the paint. "Not yet, but I'll find out." Dan glanced at her. "Have you had any issues lately? Anyone expressing particularly strong feelings about these kinds of topics?" The Reverend paused, leaning back on her heels. "There's been some tension. You know, the county's been considering adding LGBTQ protections to the non-discrimination ordinance. Some folks have been vocal about opposing it. I gave a sermon a few weeks ago about loving thy neighbor and I got some pointed feedback." Dan filed that information away. From anyone in particular? Hank Peterson was the most vocal, but that's no surprise. Hank's been against every change to this town since indoor plumbing. She resumed, scrubbing. "Dan, I hope you catch whoever did this. This isn't who we are, or at least it's not who I want us to be." After they finished at the church, Dan and Katie drove by the grocery store, where owner Tom Chen was power washing the same kind of hateful graffiti from his back wall. "Third time this month," Tom said grimly. "First 2 times it was just random tags, this time they got specific." Dan took more photos, cataloged everything, started building his case, but a gnawing worry had taken root in his chest. This wasn't random. Someone in Clearwater had decided that hate was worth advertising, and that made Dan's carefully constructed secret relationship suddenly feel a lot more dangerous. His phone buzzed. "Ethan, lunch at me's. Haven't seen you in 2 days and I'm going through withdrawal." Dan hesitated, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. 2 days ago he would have said yes without thinking. Now, with fresh evidence of hatred literally painted on his town's walls, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't before. But saying no, pulling away, that felt like letting the vandals win before they'd even been caught. "Dan, yeah, see you at noon." Me's diner was busy with the lunch crowd when Dan arrived. Ethan was already there, sitting in their usual booth by the window, two menus waiting. He looked up when Dan slid into the seat across from him and his smile faded slightly. "Rough morning," he asked quietly. "You could say that?" Dan glanced around, making sure no one was in earshot. "Someone's been vandalizing buildings, homophobic slurs." Ethan's expression sobered. "I heard, Tom Chen mentioned it when he came by the store this morning. You okay?" The question caught Dan off guard. Most people would have asked about the investigation, about leads or suspects. Ethan asked if he was okay. "I don't know," Dan admitted. "It's making me think about everything, about what we're doing." "What we're doing," Ethan repeated carefully. "You mean us?" "Yeah." Me appeared before Ethan could respond, her order pad at the ready. "Sheriff Ethan, the usual." "Please," Dan said, grateful for the interruption. After Me left, Ethan leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "Talk to me, Dan, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that someone in this town hates people like us enough to paint it on buildings. I'm thinking that if anyone found out about us, I'd lose everything, my job, my reputation, maybe my safety." Dan's hands clenched on the table. "And I'm thinking that I'm a coward for caring more about that than I care about doing the right thing." "You're not a coward," Ethan said firmly. "You're being realistic. This isn't Seattle or San Francisco. This is rural Montana and you're the sheriff. You have every reason to be careful." "But doesn't that make me part of the problem? Hiding who I am, staying silent." Ethan reached across the table and squeezed Dan's hand briefly before pulling back. "It makes you human and smart. There's a difference between being true to yourself and painting a target on your back. You get to decide when and how you come out if you ever do. Nobody else gets to make that call." Dan looked at this man across from him, this unexpected gift who'd walked into his life and changed everything. "Aren't you angry that I won't, that I can't?" "No," Ethan interrupted. "I'm not angry. I told you I'd be patient and I meant it. What I need to know is whether this is making you want to pull away from me, from us, because if it is, I need to know now." Dan met his eyes. "It scares me, all of it scares me, but pulling away from you scares me more." The relief on Ethan's face was visible. "Okay, then we keep being careful, we keep doing what we're doing, and you investigate this vandalism and catch whoever's doing it because that's your job and you're damn good at it." Me returned with their food and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But Dan felt the weight of the morning settling on his shoulders like the Montana snow, persistent and impossible to ignore. Over the next week, the vandalism continued. The library, the community center, even the welcome sign at the edge of town. Dan worked the case methodically, pulling security footage, interviewing witnesses, following every lead. But the vandal was careful, always hitting late at night when the streets were empty, always choosing locations without cameras. The town council called an emergency meeting. Dan stood before them in the crowded community center, giving his report while trying not to look at Ethan, who sat in the back row taking notes for an article he was writing for the local newsletter. "We're pursuing several leads," Dan said, keeping his voice professional. "I've increased patrols and we're working with county to see if there's been similar activity elsewhere." "This is unacceptable," Bill Thompson blustered. "We can't have this kind of thing in Clearwater. It's bad for property values, bad for tourism." "It's bad because it's hateful," Reverend Matthews cut in sharply. "Let's not lose sight of that, Bill. This isn't about property values, it's about someone in our community spreading vitriol. Maybe if certain people would stop trying to force their agendas down our throats," Hank Peterson muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The room went still. Dan felt his jaw clench. "Mr. Peterson," he said evenly, "I'm not sure what agenda you're referring to, but I can assure you that vandalism and hate speech are crimes, regardless of anyone's personal opinions on social issues." "All I'm saying," Hank continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension he was creating, "is that some of us still believe in traditional values, and maybe this is what happens when people try to change things too fast." "Are you suggesting the vandalism is justified?" Reverend Matthews asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm suggesting that actions have consequences." Dan opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan stood up in the back. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the room. I'm relatively new here, so maybe I'm missing something, but are we seriously debating whether hate crimes are an understandable response to what? People existing, wanting equal rights? Every head in the room turned to look at Ethan. Dan's heart hammered in his chest. Mr. Cole, Bill Thompson said with forced patience, this is a complex community issue that. No, it's really not, Ethan interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now. It's actually very simple. Someone is vandalizing property and spreading hatred. That's illegal and wrong, full stop. There's no complex community issue that makes it okay. Easy for you to say, Hank Peterson shot back. You're not from here, you don't understand how things work. I understand that human decency should work the same everywhere, Ethan said. And I understand that the sheriff is doing his job trying to catch a criminal, and maybe we should support him instead of making excuses for whoever's doing this. The room erupted in a mixture of applause and angry muttering. Dan used the chaos to restore order, calling the meeting back to focus. But for the rest of the session, he was acutely aware of Ethan's presence, of the risk he'd just taken speaking out so publicly. After the meeting, Dan hung back, answering questions and accepting complaints from various council members. By the time he finished, most people had filtered out. Ethan was waiting by his truck in the parking lot, breath visible in the cold air. That was brave, Dan said quietly, approaching him, and stupid, you just painted a target on your back. Maybe, but I wasn't going to sit there and listen to that garbage without saying something. Ethan looked at Dan and his expression softened. Are you mad? No, terrified for you but not mad. Dan glanced around the mostly empty lot. You should go, I'll call you later. Dan, please just go before someone sees us and starts connecting dots. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded and got in his truck. Dan watched him drive away, feeling like he'd just failed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. His phone rang as he walked to his own vehicle. Katie. Boss, we got him, the vandal, caught him red-handed spray painting the post office. Dan's adrenaline spiked. On my way, who is it? You're not going to like it. 20 minutes later, Dan stood in the sheriff's station, staring through the window of the holding cell at Jake Peterson, Hank Peterson's 19-year-old son. The kid sat on the bench, spray paint still staining his hands, looking defiant and scared in equal measure. Katie had the evidence bagged, the paint cans, photographs of Jake in the act, a notebook they'd found in his truck filled with more slurs and hateful screeds. He's asking for his dad, Katie said quietly. Dan's mind raced. Hank Peterson was one of the most vocal opponents of what he called the gay agenda. His son getting arrested for hate crimes was going to be a nightmare for the investigation, for the town, and for Dan personally, given his connection to Ethan. Call Hank, Dan said finally, and call County. This is going to need to be handled by the book, every step documented. I don't want any questions about procedure. Over the next few hours, Dan conducted the interview, read Jake his rights, processed all the paperwork. Jake admitted to the vandalism, claimed he was just defending traditional values, and showed no remorse. Hank arrived blustering and defensive, hired a lawyer, tried to intimidate Dan into leniency for his son. Dan remained professional, courteous, and absolutely unmoved. By the time he finished all the paperwork and handed Jake over to county custody for arraignment, it was after midnight. Dan sat in his office, exhausted and wired, and pulled out his phone. Ethan answered on the first ring. Hey, heard you got him. News travels fast. Katie stopped by to tell me she thought I'd want to know. Ethan paused. You okay? Can I come over? Always. Dan drove through the sleeping town to the bookstore, parking in the back alley where his truck wouldn't be visible from the street. Ethan was waiting at the back door, and the moment Dan stepped inside, he felt something in him crack open. Hey, Ethan said softly, closing the door behind them. Talk to me. And Dan did. Standing in the dim back room of the bookstore, surrounded by boxes of books and the lingering smell of coffee, he talked. About the arrest, about Hank's rage, about Jake's hate-filled notebook. About the fear that had been gnawing at him all week, the terror of being discovered, the weight of carrying a secret that felt like it might crush him. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when Dan finally ran out of words, he pulled him into a hug. Dan stiffened for just a second. Even here, even alone, the instinct to pull away was strong, but then he let himself lean in, let himself be held. You did the right thing, Ethan said against his ear. You caught him, you upheld the law, you protected people. Protected everyone except myself, Dan said with a bitter laugh. Except us. You're protecting us by being smart, by being careful. Ethan pulled back just enough to meet Dan's eyes. I know this is hard, I know you're scared, but we're going to figure it out. What if we can't? What if there's no version of this that works? Then we'll deal with that when we get there, but I'm not giving up on you, Dan Mercer, and I don't think you're giving up on me either. Dan looked at this man who'd somehow become essential to him in just a few months, who made him want to be braver than he knew how to be. I'm not. I just wish I knew how to do this without being terrified all the time. I don't think that's possible, Ethan said honestly. Fear is part of it, but so is this. He kissed Dan softly, carefully, like he was something precious. So are these moments, so is knowing that someone sees you, really sees you and wants you anyway. They went upstairs to Ethan's apartment, and for a few hours Dan let himself forget about the town outside, about his badge and his legacy and all the reasons this couldn't work. He let himself just be with Ethan, learning the warmth of his skin, the sound of his breath, the way he laughed when Dan said something unexpectedly funny. He left before dawn, as always, driving through the silent town as the sky began to lighten in the east. His phone buzzed as he pulled into his driveway. Ethan, thank you for trusting me with this. With you, sleep well, Sheriff. Dan sat in his truck for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the mountains, thinking about trust and fear and the careful architecture of a double life. He didn't know how this would end, didn't know if there was a future where he could be both the sheriff Clearwater needed and the man who loved Ethan Cole. But as he climbed out of his truck and headed inside to catch a few hours of sleep before his shift started, Dan realized something important. He was willing to find out. And maybe that was enough. Part 6, Pressure Points. The arrest of Jake Peterson sent shockwaves through Clearwater. In a town where everyone was connected by blood or friendship or shared history, charging a local kid, even one who'd committed a crime, felt to some like a betrayal. Hank Peterson led the charge naturally. Within days of Jake's arraignment, he'd organized a petition calling for Dan to be removed from office. He showed up at the sheriff's station with a clipboard and righteous fury, demanding to speak with Dan. You're letting this town go to hell, Hank spat across Dan's desk. First you allow that bookstore to open, hosting God knows what kind of people, then you persecute my son for standing up for traditional values. Dan kept his expression neutral, his hands folded on the desk. Your son vandalized public and private property, he spray-painted hateful slurs on a church. Those are crimes, Hank. My personal feelings about it don't enter into it. Don't give me that, this is personal. Ever since that Cole character came to town, you've been different, spending all your time at his store defending his kind. Dan's jaw tightened at his kind, but he kept his voice level. Ethan Cole is a business owner and a member of this community. I support all local businesses equally. That's not what I'm hearing. People are talking, Dan, about how much time you spend with him, about how you're always defending those people. Hank leaned forward. This town has values and we expect our sheriff to share them. My job is to enforce the law, not conform to anyone's idea of values. Dan stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Your son broke the law, he's facing the consequences, that's how justice works. Justice, Hank scoffed, we'll see about that. I've got half the town ready to vote you out come next election. After Hank left, Dan sat back down heavily. Katie appeared in his doorway moments later. I heard, she said, what an asshole. He's got a right to his opinion. His opinion is bigoted garbage and you know it. Katie came in and closed the door. Boss, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Dan's stomach dropped. What? Are you okay? Really okay? Because watching Hank tear into you like that, watching you have to just sit there and take it? She shook her head. That can't be easy, especially when he's attacking someone you care about. I care about everyone in this town. That's not what I mean. Katie's gaze was direct, unflinching. I've worked with you for 6 years, Dan. I know you, and I've noticed how you are around Ethan, how different you seem. Dan's heart pounded. Katie. I don't need you to tell me anything you're not ready to tell me, she interrupted. I just need you to know that whatever it is, whoever you are, it doesn't change the fact that you're the best sheriff this town has ever had, and that some of us have your back no matter what. Dan stared at her throat tight. Thank you, he managed. Don't thank me, just don't let assholes like Hank Peterson make you feel like you have to be anything other than who you are. She turned to go, then paused. Also, for what it's worth, Ethan's good for you. I like seeing you happy. After she left, Dan sat in the quiet of his office for a long time, Katie's words echoing in his head. He pulled out his phone and texted Ethan, "Can you meet me tonight? Usual place." Ethan, always, 8 p.m. Dan, see you then. The usual place had become a spot about 20 minutes outside of town, a turnoff on the old highway that led to a small clearing overlooking the valley. It was private, isolated, and completely invisible from the road. They'd started meeting there when staying at the apartment felt too risky, when Dan needed to see Ethan but couldn't risk his truck being spotted. Dan arrived first, parking his personal vehicle, a beat-up Ford F-150 he'd had since college, and waiting. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ethan's SUV appeared a few minutes later, pulling up next to Dan's truck. They both got out, and Ethan immediately pulled Dan into a kiss that tasted like relief. "Rough day?" Ethan asked when they separated. "Hank Peterson came by. He's organizing a petition to have me removed from office." Ethan's expression darkened. "Can he do that?" "Technically, yes, if enough people sign it, there could be a recall election, but I doubt he'll get the numbers." Dan leaned back against his truck. "He also implied that people are talking about how much time I spend with you." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to pull back, stop seeing each other as much in public?" "No, maybe, I don't know." Dan scrubbed a hand over his face. "Katie cornered me today. She basically told me she knows about us. And she said she has my back." "That she doesn't care." Dan looked at Ethan. "How many more people know, do you think? How many have figured it out?" "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters, if people know, if rumors start spreading." "Then what?" Ethan asked, not unkindly. "What's the worst that happens?" Dan stared at him. "I lose my job, my reputation, everything I've built." "Okay, and if that happens, if the absolute worst-case scenario comes true, then what?" "Then Dan trailed off, realizing he'd never actually let himself think past that point. The fear had always stopped him before he could imagine what came after. "Then you'd still be you," Ethan said quietly. "Still be a good man, a good cop. You'd figure it out. Maybe you'd move, start somewhere new. Maybe you'd stay and fight for your place here, but you'd survive it, Dan. You're stronger than you think." "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple, it's terrifying. But staying in the closet forever, hiding who you are, never letting yourself be fully known, that's terrifying too, just in a different way." Ethan moved closer, taking Dan's hands. "I'm not trying to push you out before you're ready. I promised I wouldn't, and I meant it. But I need you to understand that this fear, it's not going to go away. You're going to have to decide eventually whether the fear of being known is worse than the cost of hiding." Dan looked at their joined hands, at the way Ethan's fingers intertwined with his own. "What if I'm not brave enough?" "You're the bravest person I know, you just don't see it yet." Ethan squeezed his hands. "You arrested Hank Peterson's son knowing there'd be consequences. You've built a life here based on integrity and service. That takes courage. This is just a different kind of brave." They stood there as the sun finished setting, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Dan told Ethan about his day, about the petition and Hank's accusations and the weight of expectation he'd been carrying since he first pinned on his badge. Ethan talked about the bookstore, about a customer who'd come in that morning, and quietly thanked him for speaking up at the town council meeting, about the book club he was organizing, and how Martha Henderson had volunteered to bring snacks. "She also asked me if I was seeing anyone," Ethan said with a slight smile. "I think she's trying to set me up with her grandson." Despite everything, Dan laughed. "What did you tell her?" "That I was flattered, but my heart was already spoken for." Ethan's eyes met Dan's. "She seemed disappointed but said whoever it was must be very special." "You told her that?" "Not in so many words, but Martha's sharp, I think she understood." Dan pulled Ethan closer, resting his forehead against his. "I wish we could just be together, really together, no sneaking around, no secret meetings." "We will be someday when you're ready." "What if I'm never ready?" "Then we'll keep meeting in parking lots and stolen moments, and I'll keep being patient because you're worth it." Ethan kissed him softly. But I don't think that's how this ends. I think you're braver than you know. They stayed until full dark until the temperature dropped and Dan finally, reluctantly, said he needed to get home. They kissed goodbye, a lingering, promising kiss that made Dan's chest ache with wanting more. As Dan drove home through the quiet night, he thought about what Ethan had said, about fear and courage and the cost of hiding, about what came after the worst-case scenario, a question he'd never let himself ask. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. Sarah. Hey, he answered, everything okay? Everything's fine, I just heard about the Peterson situation, wanted to check on you. News really does travel fast. This is Montana, the entire state probably knows by now. Sarah's voice was warm with concern. How are you holding up? I'm managing, it's complicated. Is this about Ethan? Dan closed his eyes. Partly, Hank implied that people are talking about how much time I spend with him. Let them talk. Easy for you to say, you don't live here anymore. No, but I lived there for 26 years and I know exactly how it works. People talk, Dan, they always have, they always will. The question is whether you're going to let their talk control your life. She paused. Do you love him? The question caught Dan off guard. Love. He'd been so focused on fear and secrecy and managing risk that he hadn't let himself name what he felt. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe it's only been a few months. That's long enough to know. When I met Tom, I knew in 3 weeks that I wanted to spend my life with him. Time isn't the measure, feeling is. Dan sat in his truck, engine cooling, thinking about Ethan's laugh and his patient understanding and the way Dan felt like his best self when they were together. Yeah, he said quietly, I think I do love him. Then that's your answer, Dan. Everything else, the job, the town, the fear, it's all just noise. The question is whether love is worth the risk. After they hung up, Dan sat in the darkness for a long time, Sarah's words echoing in his head. Was love worth the risk? He'd spent 20 years convinced the answer was no, that duty and reputation and the safety of the closet were worth more than the possibility of happiness. But now, with Ethan in his life, he wasn't so sure anymore. Part 7 Breaking Point. December rolled into January and the tension in Clearwater continued to simmer. Jake Peterson's trial was scheduled for February, and Hank had made it his personal mission to make Dan's life as difficult as possible. The petition had garnered a few hundred signatures, not enough for a recall election, but enough to make things uncomfortable. Dan threw himself into work, taking extra shifts, volunteering for every call. If he was busy enough, he reasoned, he wouldn't have time to think about the precarious balance of his double life. But Ethan noticed. You're pulling away, Ethan said one evening when Dan had canceled their plans for the 3rd time that week. They were standing in the back room of the bookstore, surrounded by boxes of new inventory that Ethan had been unpacking when Dan stopped by to deliver the bad news in person. I'm not pulling away, I'm just busy, it's part of the job. Dan, Ethan set down the book he'd been holding and turned to face him fully. Don't lie to me, if you need space, if this is getting to be too much, just tell me, but don't pretend it's about work. Dan felt something snap inside him, the careful control he'd been maintaining for months suddenly felt too heavy to hold. You want the truth? Fine, I'm terrified. Every day I'm terrified that someone's going to figure it out, that I'm going to lose everything. I can barely sleep, I can't focus at work. And every time I'm with you, it gets harder to pretend that this is sustainable. Ethan flinched like he'd been hit. So what are you saying? I don't know what I'm saying, I just know that I can't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, hiding, lying by omission every single day. Dan's voice cracked. I love you and it's killing me. The words hung in the air between them. It was the first time either of them had said it out loud. You love me, Ethan repeated slowly, but you're breaking up with me. I'm not. Dan stopped. Was he? I don't want to, but I don't know how to do this, how to be with you and be the sheriff and keep everything from falling apart. So don't keep everything from falling apart. Ethan's voice was raw. Let it fall apart. Maybe what you build from the pieces will be better than what you have now. Easy for you to say, you're not the one who'd lose everything. You think I'm not risking anything? Ethan's laugh was bitter. I moved to this town, invested everything I have in a business that depends on community support. If people decide they don't like me, if they boycott my store because I'm gay, because I'm with you, I could lose everything too. but I did it anyway because I thought you were worth the risk. Ethan. No, let me finish. I've been patient, I've been understanding, I've let you set every boundary, control every aspect of how we do this, and I did it because I love you, because I thought eventually you'd be ready to at least meet me halfway. Ethan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But I can't keep being your secret, Dan. I told you that from the beginning. I won't be the person you hide. I'm not hiding you, I'm protecting us both. By never touching me in public, by parking 3 blocks away when you come here, by leaving before dawn every single time. Ethan shook his head. That's not protection, Dan, that's shame, and I won't be someone's source of shame. The words hit Dan like a physical blow. That's not fair. Isn't it? When was the last time we went somewhere together in daylight? When was the last time you didn't check 3 times to make sure no one was watching before you kissed me? Ethan wiped at his eyes angrily. I knew what I was signing up for. I knew it would be hard, but I didn't realize you'd be so deep in the closet that there's no room for me in there with you. Dan felt like the floor was falling out from under him. So what do you want from me? You want me to quit my job, leave Clearwater, burn down everything I've built? I want you to believe that you deserve happiness. I want you to stop acting like loving me is some kind of tragedy instead of the best thing that's ever happened to us. Ethan's voice broke. But most of all, I want you to want me enough to fight for it, and I don't think you do. That's not true. Then prove it. Ethan met his eyes, and Dan had never seen him look so vulnerable, so hurt. Make a choice, Dan, not today, not tomorrow, but soon, because I can't keep waiting for you to decide that I'm worth the risk. Dan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He stood there, frozen, as Ethan turned away and went back to unpacking books with hands that shook slightly. You should go, Ethan said without looking at him. I need some space. Dan left. He got in his truck and drove, not heading home or to the office but just driving through the dark winter night, Ethan's words echoing in his head. I won't be someone's source of shame. Was that what he was doing? Turning Ethan into something to be hidden, something shameful? The thought made Dan sick. Ethan deserved better than that, deserved someone who could love him openly, proudly, without fear. But Dan wasn't that person, couldn't be that person, could he? He ended up at the overlook where they'd first admitted their feelings for each other. The valley stretched out below, Clearwater's lights twinkling in the darkness. This town, this badge, this life, it was all he'd ever known. Giving it up felt impossible. But losing Ethan felt worse. Dan pulled out his phone and called the one person who might understand. Sarah, he said when she answered, I think I'm about to do something either really brave or really stupid, and I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy. Part 8, the choice. Dan didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him, and thought about everything Sarah had said. You've spent your whole life being what other people need you to be, she'd told him gently. Your father's son, the town's sheriff, my husband, even though we both knew it was a lie. When are you going to let yourself just be Dan? I don't know who that is anymore. Yes, you do. He's the man who loves Ethan Cole. He's the man who stood up to Hank Peterson to protect what's right. He's the man who's brave enough to wear that badge every day, even when it's heavy. He's just been hiding for so long he forgot he existed. Now, as dawn broke over the mountains, Dan made a decision. Not the easy one, not the safe one, but the one he should have made months ago. He showed up at chapter and verse before it opened, finding Ethan in the back room doing inventory. Ethan looked up when Dan entered, his expression guarded. Hey, Dan said. Hey. I need to tell you something and I need you to not interrupt until I'm done, okay? Ethan nodded warily. Dan took a deep breath. You were right about all of it. I've been so focused on protecting my reputation and my job and this image I've built that I forgot what actually matters. And the truth is, none of it matters without you. The badge, the town, my father's legacy, it's all meaningless if I have to hide who I am to keep it. He moved closer to Ethan, holding his gaze. I love you, I'm in love with you, and I'm tired of acting like that's something to hide, so I'm not going to hide anymore. Ethan's eyes widened. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm going to tell people, not make some big announcement, but stop hiding, stop lying. If someone asks, I'll tell them. And if I lose my job over it, if I lose half the town's respect, then so be it, because losing you is worse than any of that. Dan, you don't have to. Yes, I do. You were right. I was turning you into my shame instead of my joy, and you deserve so much better than that. Dan reached out and took Ethan's hands. You deserve someone who's proud to be with you, and I am proud. I just needed to find the courage to show it. Ethan pulled him into a fierce hug, and Dan felt him shaking. Are you sure, really sure, because once you do this, there's no taking it back. I'm sure. I'm terrified, but I'm sure. They held each other for a long moment, and Dan felt something he hadn't felt in years: lightness. Like a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there had finally lifted. So what's the plan? Ethan asked, pulling back just enough to see Dan's face. I don't really have one. I thought I'd just start living honestly, stop hiding, see what happens. That's a terrible plan, Ethan said, but he was smiling through his tears. Yeah, probably, but it's the best I've got. Ethan kissed him, sweet and sure, and when they pulled apart, his smile was radiant. Okay, then let's do this together. Together, Dan agreed. The opportunity came sooner than Dan expected. That afternoon, he and Katie were at Me's diner for lunch, sitting at the counter and discussing a case when Bill Thompson walked in with several other council members. They took the booth behind Dan and Katie, and their voices carried clearly. I'm telling you, something's got to be done about Mercer, Bill was saying. The Peterson boys' trial is in 3 weeks, and Hank's already talking about filing a civil suit against the department for wrongful prosecution. That's ridiculous, someone else responded. The kid admitted to it. Doesn't matter, Hank's got money and lawyers, and he's convinced Dan has some kind of personal vendetta, all because of that bookstore owner. Katie tensed next to Dan, glancing at him. Dan took a deep breath. This was it, the moment. He could let it pass, could stay silent, or he could take the leap. He turned around in his stool to face the booth. Actually, Bill, since you're discussing me, maybe I should clarify a few things. Bill looked startled. Sheriff, we were just speculating about my motives for arresting Jake Peterson. Let me clear that up for you. I arrested him because he committed multiple crimes. My personal life has nothing to do with it. No one's saying it does, Bill said defensively. But you are saying that my relationship with Ethan Cole somehow clouds my judgment. So let me be clear, yes, Ethan and I are close. In fact, we're involved, romantically. Dan heard Katie's sharp inhale next to him, heard the sudden silence fall over the diner. And that has absolutely nothing to do with how I do my job. I enforce the law equally for everyone in this town, regardless of my personal feelings. Jake Peterson broke the law, that's why he was arrested. End of story. The booth was silent. Actually, the entire diner was silent. Dan could feel every eye in the place on him. Bill Thompson's face had gone red. You're saying you're. I'm saying I'm dating Ethan Cole, have been for months, and I'm not hiding it anymore. Dan stood up, throwing cash on the counter for his untouched lunch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He walked out of the diner with his head high, aware that he'd just set off a bomb that would ripple through Clearwater for weeks to come. Katie caught up with him on the sidewalk. Boss, she said, slightly out of breath, that was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen you do. Probably both, Dan admitted. His hands were shaking, but he felt strangely calm. You okay with this, working for a sheriff who just came out in Me's diner? Are you kidding? That was badass, Katie grinned, though you might want to call Ethan before he hears it from someone else. Dan pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, it rang. Ethan. Please tell me you didn't just do what Martha Henderson is claiming you did, Ethan said without preamble. Depends on what Martha's saying. That you just announced to half the town that we're dating, in Me's diner, during the lunch rush. Dan couldn't help but smile. Then yeah, I did that. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Are you okay? Ask me in a few hours when the reality sets in, but right now, yeah, I'm okay. I love you, Ethan said softly. You know that, right? I know, I love you too. Dan glanced back at the diner where he could see faces pressed against the window. I should probably get back to work before the town implodes. Good idea, come by tonight, we should probably talk about what comes next. Yeah. I'll be there. Dan went back to the office where the phones were already ringing off the hook. Katie fielded calls while Dan shut himself in his office and tried to process what he'd just done. The reality of it was starting to sink in. He'd just come out publicly, in the most dramatic way possible, in a small Montana town where being gay was still something people whispered about. His phone buzzed with texts. From Sarah, I heard, I'm so proud of you. From Reverend Matthews, whatever you need, you have my support. From Tom Chen, about time, you two are good together. But there were also angry messages. From Hank Peterson, you've disgraced this badge and this town. From several council members demanding he reconsider his position. From strangers telling him exactly what they thought of him. Dan read them all, then put his phone away and got back to work. The next few days were brutal. Half the town seemed to support him, the other half wanted him gone. The petition for his recall suddenly gained new energy, with signatures coming in by the dozens. There were tense town council meetings, heated debates at the diner, divided opinions at every gathering. Ethan's bookstore saw a brief surge in business, people supporting him out of solidarity, followed by a noticeable drop as others boycotted. Someone spray-painted a slur on his door one night, and Dan personally investigated, personally caught the kid who'd done it, personally made sure charges were filed. Through it all, Dan and Ethan stood together. They went to dinner at Me's diner and sat in their usual booth, holding hands across the table. They walked down Main Street together. Dan kissed Ethan goodbye in public, in broad daylight, in full view of anyone who cared to watch. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The real test came 3 weeks later at Jake Peterson's trial. Dan testified about the arrest, about the evidence, about Jake's confession. Hank's lawyer tried to discredit him, bringing up his relationship with Ethan, implying bias. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rebecca Watts from the county office, shut that down fast. Sheriff Mercer's personal life has no bearing on whether Jake Peterson committed these crimes. The evidence speaks for itself. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Jake guilty on all counts. Vandalism, hate crimes, destruction of property. He was sentenced to community service, restitution, and mandatory counseling. Outside the courthouse, Hank Peterson confronted Dan. "This isn't over," he spat. "That recall petition has enough signatures, we're forcing an election." "That's your right," Dan said calmly. "I'll respect whatever the town decides." "You've disgraced this badge." "No, Hank, your son disgraced this town by spray painting hate all over it. I just did my job." Dan met his eyes steadily. "And I'll keep doing it whether you like it or not." That evening, Dan sat with Ethan on the bookstore balcony, watching the sun set over Clearwater. They'd made it through the trial, through the worst of the immediate fallout. But the recall election loomed, and Dan knew it would be the ultimate test. "How are you feeling about it?" Ethan asked, his hand warm in Dan's. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me is terrified I'll lose. Part of me is terrified I'll win and have to keep dealing with all of this." Dan sighed. "But I don't regret it, coming out, being with you. Even if I lose the badge, I don't regret it." "That's growth," Ethan said with a slight smile. "A few months ago you couldn't even imagine losing the badge." "A few months ago I didn't know what I'd be losing it for." Dan turned to look at Ethan, this man who'd changed his entire life. "You're worth it. Whatever happens, you're worth it." Ethan kissed him, soft and sure. "So are you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. Dan thought about his father, about the legacy he'd been so afraid of tarnishing. But his father had always said that the badge meant serving the community with integrity and honor. And wasn't that what Dan was doing? Living with integrity, being honest about who he was, loving who he loved without shame. Maybe he wasn't tarnishing the legacy, maybe he was adding to it. "Whatever happens with the election," Dan said quietly, "I want you to know something. Meeting you, falling for you, it woke something up in me that I'd buried for 20 years. You made me remember what it feels like to be fully alive, and even if I lose everything else, I'll always have that." Ethan's eyes were bright in the fading light. "You're not going to lose everything. You're going to win that election, and you're going to keep being the best sheriff this town has ever had, and you're going to do it as yourself, fully and completely. That's my prediction." Pretty confident for someone who's only lived here 6 months. "I know this town better than you think, and I know you. You're what Clearwater needs, even if some people are too stubborn to see it yet." Dan hoped he was right. But either way, sitting here with Ethan, watching the stars come out over Montana, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not certainty, not safety, but the deep peace of finally being honest, of finally being whole. And maybe that was worth more than any badge. #part 9 The campaign. The recall election was scheduled for late March, giving Dan 6 weeks to campaign for his own job. It felt surreal walking door to door in a town he'd protected for 2 decades, asking people to vote for him based not just on his record but on their acceptance of who he was. Some doors slammed in his face. Others opened wide with embraces and assurances of support. Most fell somewhere in between, polite, uncertain, promising to think about it. Ethan wanted to campaign with him, but Dan drew the line there. This needs to be about my qualifications, my record. If you're with me, it becomes about us. It already is about us, Ethan pointed out. You can't separate the two. Maybe not, but I can keep the focus where it needs to be. So Dan campaigned alone, with Katie handling logistics and Sarah driving up from Helena on weekends to help. He talked about his 20 years of service, the drop in crime rates under his leadership, the relationships he'd built with the community. He acknowledged his relationship with Ethan honestly when asked, but always brought the conversation back to his qualifications. Hank Peterson, meanwhile, ran a campaign based entirely on traditional values and the idea that Dan had betrayed the town's trust. He found a candidate to run against Dan Roy Mitchell, a former deputy who'd retired 5 years ago and who had all the right credentials and none of Dan's baggage. The town split down the middle. Yard signs went up, "Re-elect Mercer versus Mitchell for sheriff." The local paper ran editorials both for and against Dan. Town council meetings became battlegrounds of competing opinions. Through it all, Dan tried to stay focused on the job. Crime didn't stop for elections. People still needed help, still called the sheriff's office with emergencies and complaints and requests for assistance. Dan responded to every call, treated every person with respect, and tried to prove through his actions that nothing had changed except his honesty. But it wore on him. The constant scrutiny, the judgment, the feeling that every move he made was being evaluated not just as a sheriff but as a gay man trying to keep his job in rural Montana. He lost weight. He wasn't sleeping well. The stress showed in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Ethan noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You need to take care of yourself," Ethan said one evening when Dan came by the bookstore after a particularly brutal day of campaigning. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't coffee?" "I had a granola bar this morning." "Dan," Ethan's voice was gentle but firm, "you can't campaign on fumes. Come upstairs, I made dinner." Dan followed him up to the apartment where Ethan had indeed made dinner, pot roast with vegetables, homemade bread, everything warm and comforting. They ate in silence for a while and Dan felt some of the day's tension ease out of his shoulders. "Thank you," he said finally, "for this, for everything." "You don't have to thank me for taking care of you. It's what people who love each other do." Ethan reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "I just wish I could do more, campaign with you, defend you publicly when people say awful things. You do enough just by being here, by being patient with all of this." "I'm not always patient. Sometimes I want to grab people by the shoulders and shake them until they see how amazing you are." Ethan smiled slightly, "but I restrain myself." "Very mature of you." They finished dinner and Dan helped with the dishes. And for a little while he let himself forget about elections and campaigns and everything riding on the town's decision. He let himself just be with Ethan in this small apartment above a bookstore, living the life he'd never thought he could have. Later, lying in Ethan's bed with his head on Ethan's chest, listening to his heartbeat, Dan said, "What happens if I lose? Then we figure out what comes next." "That's not much of a plan." "Maybe not, but it's honest." Ethan's fingers traced idle patterns on Dan's shoulder. "I know you love being sheriff, I know it's important to you, but it's not all you are, Dan. If you lose the badge, you're still you, still someone who cares about people, who wants to make a difference. You'll find another way to do that." "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then you'll learn, we'll learn together." Dan closed his eyes, letting Ethan's words wash over him. The fear was still there, the fear of losing, of being rejected by the town he'd served for so long. But underneath it was something else, the knowledge that whatever happened, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The weeks crawled by. Dan campaigned tirelessly, attending every community event, speaking at the Rotary Club and the Ladies' Auxiliary and anywhere else that would have him. He gave interviews to the local paper, appeared on the tiny radio station that broadcasted out of Helena, did everything he could to remind people of who he was beyond his sexuality. And slowly, gradually, he started to see the tide shift. People who'd been uncertain began to voice their support. Business owners put up his campaign signs. Even some of the more conservative members of the community acknowledged that while they might not agree with his lifestyle, they couldn't deny that he'd been a good sheriff. 2 weeks before the election, something unexpected happened. Reverend Matthews devoted her entire sermon to the topic of judgment and acceptance. Dan wasn't there. He'd stopped going to church after his divorce, finding the weight of other people's piety exhausting, but the whole town was talking about it. According to reports, she'd spoken about Jesus dining with tax collectors and sinners, about the danger of throwing stones in glass houses, about how easy it was to judge others for being different while ignoring one's own failings. She never mentioned Dan by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She basically told the whole congregation that voting against you would be unchristian, Katie reported gleefully. You should have seen Bill Thompson's face. I thought he was going to have an aneurysm. She didn't have to do that, Dan said, but he was touched nonetheless. Yeah, she did, because it's the right thing to do, just like what you did was the right thing to do. The final week before the election was a blur. Last-minute campaign pushes, door-to-door canvassing, a town hall where Dan and Roy Mitchell faced off in front of a packed community center. Mitchell was professional, experienced, and carefully avoided any directly discriminatory language while making it clear that he represented a return to traditional leadership. Dan spoke from the heart. He talked about his love for Clearwater, his commitment to the job, his record of service. And when someone in the crowd asked him directly if he thought a gay man could be an effective sheriff in a conservative town, he looked them in the eye and said, I think a good sheriff is someone who serves every member of their community equally, regardless of their personal feelings. I've been doing that for 20 years, and my sexuality hasn't changed that. The only thing that's changed is that I'm not lying about who I am anymore. And I think that makes me a better sheriff, not a worse one. The applause was mixed, some enthusiastic, some polite, some conspicuously absent. But Dan held his head high and finished the debate with dignity. Election day arrived gray and cold, with a late winter storm threatening. Dan voted early, dropping his ballot in the box at the county courthouse before heading to the office. He tried to work, tried to focus on anything other than the clock slowly ticking toward the end of polling hours. Ethan called around lunchtime. How are you holding up? Ask me in 12 hours. Want company tonight while we wait for results. Dan thought about it. Part of him wanted to face this alone, to maintain the professional distance he'd always kept between his personal life and his job. But that was the old Dan, the one who'd hidden and compartmentalized and kept everyone at arm's length. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. Results would start coming in around 8 after the polls closed. Dan finished his shift, went home to shower and change, then headed to chapter and verse. Ethan was waiting upstairs with comfort food and nervous energy in equal measure. I made lasagna, Ethan said. Stress cooking, also cookies and brownies. We might have enough food for a small army. Despite his nerves, Dan smiled. Good thing I'm hungry. They ate dinner trying to talk about anything but the election. Ethan told Dan about a book order that had come in wrong, about Mrs. Henderson's grandson who'd actually asked him out. Ethan had politely declined, about his plans for a spring reading series featuring local authors. Dan talked about a call he'd responded to that morning. Mrs. Patterson's cat stuck in a tree for the 3rd time this month, and they both laughed at the absurdity of it, the normalcy of small-town problems that had nothing to do with elections or sexuality or anything more complicated than a particularly adventurous feline. At 8 o'clock, they turned on the laptop to watch results come in. The county website would post precinct-by-precinct totals as they were counted. The first results appeared at 8:15. Precinct 1, Mercer 178, Mitchell 156. Dan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That's the east side, more liberal. You're winning, Ethan pointed out. 1 precinct out of 8. More results trickled in. Precinct 2, Mitchell ahead by 30 votes. Precinct 3, Dan ahead by 12. It was going to be close, every vote would matter. By 9 o'clock, 6 of 8 precincts had reported. Dan was ahead by 87 votes total, but the 2 remaining precincts were both rural, conservative areas where Mitchell was expected to do well. Dan's phone rang. Katie. You seeing this? She asked without preamble. Yeah. It's going to come down to the wire, Precinct 7 just came in, Mitchell up by 45 there. Dan did the math in his head. He'd been ahead by 87. Now he was ahead by 42 with one precinct left to report. Ethan took his hand and squeezed, "Breathe." Dan realized he'd forgotten to. He took a shaky breath, then another, watching the screen like it held the answer to his entire future. At 9:37 p.m., the final precinct reported. Dan stared at the numbers, unable to quite process what he was seeing. Ethan made a sound next to him, something between a laugh and a sob. Precinct 8, Mercer 201, Mitchell 193. Final tally, Mercer 1,247, Mitchell 1,203. Dan had won by 44 votes out of 2,400 cast, but he'd won. His phone exploded with calls and texts. Katie, Sarah, Reverend Matthews, Tom Chen, dozens of others, but Dan couldn't look at any of them yet. He turned to Ethan, who was watching him with tears streaming down his face. "You did it," Ethan whispered. "You won." "We won," Dan corrected. He pulled Ethan into his arms, holding him tight. "I couldn't have done this without you." They stood there in the small apartment, holding each other while Dan's phone continued to buzz insistently with congratulations. Outside, through the window, Dan could see people gathering on Main Street, supporters celebrating with impromptu cheers and car horns honking. "I should probably go down there," Dan said eventually. "Say something." "Probably," Ethan agreed, but neither of them moved. Finally, Dan pulled back enough to look at Ethan. "Come with me, please. I don't want to do this without you." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending you're not the most important person in my life." Dan took Ethan's hand. "Let's go celebrate together." They walked downstairs and out onto Main Street where a crowd had gathered outside the bookstore. When people saw Dan emerge, saw him holding Ethan's hand, a cheer went up that echoed off the buildings. Dan raised his free hand for quiet. When the crowd settled, he said, "Thank you, all of you, for believing in me, for giving me another chance to serve this community I love. I know this election was about more than qualifications or experience. It was about who we are as a town, what we value, what kind of community we want to be. And you've chosen to be a place where integrity matters more than conformity. Where service matters more than who someone loves. I'm honored, I'm humbled, and I promise to keep being the best sheriff I can be for all of you, even those who voted against me, because that's what this badge means, service to everyone." Another cheer, louder this time. Dan saw familiar faces in the crowd, Katie and Tom Chen and Reverend Matthews, Martha Henderson and her grandson, Sarah, waving from the back. And scattered throughout, people he'd known his whole life, choosing to celebrate with him despite their reservations or uncertainties. It wasn't perfect. There were still people who'd voted against him, still people who couldn't or wouldn't accept him, but it was enough. This moment, this community, this chance to keep serving while being fully himself, it was enough. Later, after the crowds dispersed and the celebrations wound down, Dan and Ethan sat on the bookstore balcony under the stars, wrapped in blankets against the cold. "How does it feel," Ethan asked, "to have everything you thought you'd lose?" Dan thought about it. "It feels like coming home, not just to Clearwater but to myself, like I finally get to be T."